No matter who you are or where you go, heading outside, even for just a few minutes, is well worth it. Welcome to Humans Outside, where we're using the Humans Outside 365 Challenge to build a life habit around spending time in nature while learning from fascinating outdoor-minded guests. I'm Amy Bouchatz. I've let curiosity be my guide as a journalist for 19 years. But life, including my husband's injuries from military service, had us looking for a better way to live. So we moved sight unseen to Alaska to see if an outdoor-focused life was the answer. Since September 2017, I've spent at least 20 consecutive minutes outside every single day, no matter what, to explore how nature can change my life. Ready to hear from experts and outdoor lovers who make heading into nature just a part of who they are while we work to do the same? Let's go! Have you ever stopped to think about the people who loved, used, or lived on your favorite outdoor spaces? This was something I thought a lot about as a kid growing up on the central coast of California. I spent hours and hours outside wandering the beach, mostly alone, and often wondered what it would have been like to be one of the alone people who once called it home. Today I spend even more time outside than I did then, living and recreating in Alaska, where there is a rich and not very distant cultural history of Indigenous land ownership. And as people who are not personally connected to or members of Indigenous nations get outside and use the land, it feels important to not just honor its past uses and heritage, but to also understand how to recreate on it and use it in such a way that does that too. So, how do you learn that? Where do you start? Today I'm excited to welcome Aaron Leggett, a member of the Dena'ina tribe and president of the Native Village of Eklutna, to help us with this subject. This subject is a passion point for him and has been part of what has driven a project he's done with the city of Anchorage to install native place name signage on popular recreation spots in the city. He's also the senior curator of Alaska history and Indigenous culture at the Anchorage Museum, and I'm really honored that he's taking the time to guide us today. Aaron, welcome to Humans Outside.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Well, I just really appreciate your time and your expertise, both personal expertise and professional expertise in this. And I'm so glad that you're willing to share that with us today and help us and guide us on this particular subject. So thank you. We start our episodes imagining ourselves in our guests' favorite outdoor space, like we're hanging out with them somewhere they love, having this conversation. So if we were going to hang out and talk with you somewhere outside, where would we be with you today?
Probably my favorite spot today is at Eklutna or Eklutna Lake. It's located about 7 miles from the village. And although there's a few cabins and recreational trails, to me, it's the one spot in Anchorage that really feels like ancient, or it's where I feel most connected to my ancestors. Looking out on the lake and seeing it, and it's beautiful. It always surprises me how many people from Anchorage have never been there. Although I will say, in the last couple of years with COVID, there does just seem to be quite an increase in people recreating, not just in Eklutna, but throughout the Anchorage parks. But certainly I've noticed quite a bit of an uptick there in the last couple of years.
Yeah, and if listeners ever look at my Instagram feed, you might have seen pictures of this spot. It's about, you said 7 miles from the village, and that is a 7 windy, narrow road miles back into this valley. The lake is this gorgeous sort of blue, ice blue color, depends on how the sky looks. And there is no cell reception back there. So it's a great place to go and just really unplug from the modern world, whether you really wanted to or not, because there is no cell service. And y'all might have seen pictures of me being out there running in the summertime. Probably saw pictures of me being out there in the wintertime. It's one of the places you mentioned, Aaron, the cabins there. We stay in the cabins a couple times a year. So if podcast listeners are familiar with my Instagram feed, you're familiar with Eklutna. So that's great. And you can imagine yourself there too. So people outside Alaska, speaking of connectivity, may imagine it to be very rural, all right? And, We know like a lot of it's rural, right? But not true of everywhere, certainly not true of Anchorage proper. So you grew up in the Anchorage area and the village where your president, as we just mentioned, sits 7 miles from that lake, but it's also off the state's most heavily used highway.
Yeah, that's correct. It's about 26 miles from downtown Anchorage. The Native Village of Eklutna is the only federally recognized tribe in the municipality of Anchorage. And basically, when you get just a little bit past Eklutna, you leave the municipality of Anchorage and you enter the Matanuska Susitna borough. So we sort of sit at the northern edge of the city, so to speak. Certainly, by Anchorage standards, Eklutna is pretty rural. When you get past Eagle River, really, I would say it becomes these small little pocket communities, and Eklutna is the smallest of those. But yeah,
But it's not in the middle of nowhere. It's
no,
not, people imagine. I get asked all the time if I live near a grocery store and I live in a subdivision, right? So this sort of imagined picture of Alaska is not where you and I live today.
no, certainly not. But thinking about how much it's changed in a couple generations, I like to tell people when my grandmother, who was born just south of the village in Birchwood, was born in 1933. Anchorage had a population of about 5,000. And when my mom was born in Peters Creek, which is about 2 miles, 2 or 3 miles south of Eklutna, Anchorage had a population of about 90,000. When I was born in Anchorage in 1981, Anchorage had a population of about 180,000. And today, I think I just saw the official census numbers were just under 300,000. We were above 300,000 a couple of years ago, but we're like at 295, I think. So within a couple of generations, you've seen this massive increase. And so the experiences that I've had growing up in Anchorage are different than the experiences my mom had, and certainly what my grandma or my great grandmother had. But, you talk about grocery stores, and I can think about, when I was a kid, even the closest proper grocery store was about maybe 15 miles from my grandmother's house. Now there's one in Birchwood about 5 miles away. So,
Right, right. So, speaking of growing up in sort of a more city esque setting, can you give us some background on your own journey, how you became to be someone who likes to head outside and who has that favorite spot as being by Eklutna Lake?
sure. So the way I like to describe it is I grew up in Anchorage. I lived a very idyllic, I guess, looking back on it, middle class, 1980s, 1990s childhood. Anybody that's watched sort of Stranger Things, I mean, minus all the weird paranormal stuff, the jumping on
Minus that.
well, jumping on the bikes and going with my friends and exploring some of the parks near us. I grew up in East Anchorage, close to the Chugach foothills. And so there was a park like right off our cul-de-sac. And then if you went maybe about 6 blocks towards the mountain, there's all sorts of trails. Technically, they're owned by the military. But in those days, as far as I know, they were only used maybe once every 5 or 6 years. I'm told now that they're getting a lot more use. But basically, we had these woods that we could go play in and run around in a group of us. I mean, it's kind of amazing. Certainly, there were bears and things back there, but we never thought about that. When we were kids. But what really changed was after I graduated high school, I had a background in tourism. I was a tour guide on the Alaska Railroad my junior year of high school, and I took tourism at the King Career Center. But in 1999, a year before I graduated, the Alaska Native Heritage Center had opened up, and I can remember them building it. But in 2001, I applied for a job at the Heritage Center because of my background primarily in tourism, and it was a good paying job. So I thought, I'll go here. I've got a background in tourism. I'll learn a little bit more about my heritage, and that'll be that. I thought I'd be doing more kind of typical tourism sort of stuff, introducing dance groups, videos, guiding people around. But I was surprised when they put me outside at the one of the Athabascan recreated village site because I felt like I wasn't from a rural setting and what would I have to say? So I learned from other people and I started reading. And within about a week or maybe about a month, I found that I was actually more interested in knowing more of my people and our background and all Alaska Natives in general than I was in sort of the standard Alaska tourism as it's normally thought about. And so the other thing was I met other young Alaska Native people and they asked me where I came from. And I said, I'm from here. And they said, no, where's your village? And I said, we're from here. And they said, what do you mean? I said, I'm from Eklutna. We're Dena'ina. And they said, what's that? And so I realized that when other young Alaska Native people, young, I say 20s and maybe even early 30s at that time, had no idea that who we were or that we still existed, I decided I wanted to change that narrative. I wasn't exactly sure how I was going to do that, but I knew it was the right thing to do, and I knew nobody was really pushing for that. So I changed majors in college and got a degree in anthropology and started working on some projects at the first at the university, and then they transitioned into my career.
Would you mind giving us some background on the Dena'ina? You mentioned Anchorage and that nobody really
Sure.
knew that you existed.
Yeah.
So talk about traditional lands and then also about lands owned and managed by your people today.
Sure. So the Dena'ina are the indigenous population of what is today typically referred to as South Central Alaska. Today, about 60% of the state's population lives within our traditional homeland. If you were to get out a map, our traditional boundaries extend down south of Anchorage to the Kenai Peninsula and into Kachemak Bay around Seldovia, across Cook Inlet towards the west side of Cook Inlet. They extend into Iliamna Lake, the sort of northeastern tip of Iliamna Lake, all of Lake Clark, the upper Stony River area, and then north of Anchorage, northeast of Anchorage, our sort of boundaries are towards just past Palmer, towards the village of Chickaloon, which is kind of a mixture between Dena'ina and Otna Athabascan people. And then north of Anchorage, they extend about 200 or about 120 miles, 130 miles north to the Talkeetna mountain area and just south of what today is now known as Denali State Park. So it's a massive geographic area, about 44,000 acres, or 44,000 square miles, excuse me. And there's four mutually intelligible dialects of Dena'ina, but we're one people. The thing that separates the Dena'ina from other northern Athabascans or Dene people, of which there's 11 in Alaska, is that we are the only northern Dene or Athabascans who lived on salt water. So if anybody knows anything about Athabascan people, they typically think of them as hunter and fisher and trappers of a boreal forest. And certainly we have all those things, but we also utilized some of the marine resources and some of the technologies, like we had kayaks and large skin boats and hunted beluga whales and some seals. Cook Inlet's not a particularly rich sealing environment, or same thing with sea otters, but there are some. So we had all those things. And also historically, Cook Inlet was a very productive ecosystem for salmon production. Um, so that's a little bit, I guess, about who the
Yeah.
nine are.
So how were your traditional lands? And well, you didn't maybe back up for a second. So those are the
Right.
traditional lands. What is your current land?
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
And I know we're going to get a little bit technical here, probably talking
Yeah.
about native
Yeah.
corporations. So if you don't mind
Yeah.
just explaining in our nutshell that I know we've talked about before, what a native corporation
Yeah.
is for people who are not familiar with that term.
Right. So in Alaska, unlike the rest of the United States, there aren't really reservations. There's one reservation at the very southeastern tip of Alaska, but that's sort of a historical anomaly. Anyways, the United States in 1867 purchased Russia's interests in Alaska. So basically, it purchased the assets of the Russian America Company and a little bit of the land that had been developed around those locations, primarily a couple of places out in the Aleutians. In particular, the Pribilof Islands, St. Michael were the big ones. So, from 1867 until really the 1890s, the issues around land in Alaska were pretty murky. There had to finally become sort of civil jurisdiction of Alaska, and the District of Alaska was created largely to settle mining claims and fish cannery owners that wanted title to their property. But Alaska Native property issues were largely ignored. And this continued into the 20th century, although certainly the federal government, through the Department of the Interior, Bureau of Indian Affairs, did manage some aspects of Native lives, just like they would in the lower 48. But what really changed is in 1959, Alaska went from being a territory to the 49th state. And in the Statehood Act, the state of Alaska was able to select, I think, about 105 or 106 million acres of land, which is roughly about a third of the state of Alaska. And so all of a sudden, lands that the new state government is selecting are usually locations where indigenous peoples of Alaska had always considered to be part of their lands, and they became worried. There were also a number of initiatives that were quite frightening to Native people, large projects. Two of them. One was called the Rampart Dam, which would have created at the time the world's largest hydroelectric dam. And what it would have done is it essentially would have blocked in the middle of the Yukon River. It would have created a massive lake and would have flooded 10 interior villages to create hydroelectric power. So that was one. And another one was near the village of Point Hope, about 20 miles from the village of Point Hope. There were plans to detonate 7 atomic bombs underwater to create the northernmost ice-free port. And the engineering and the science at the time believed that this would have no impact on the people or the animals around it. So Alaska Natives started to become concerned and
I'd say.
um, started to form local or regional associations to start lobbying to get some sort of land settlement or at least halt some of these projects. And starting in about 1966 with the formation of the Alaska Federation of Natives for about 5 years until 1971, to be exact. December 18th, 1971, Richard Nixon signed into law the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. This act allowed Alaska Natives to retain about 44 million acres of land and to receive just under $1 billion in compensation for lands that had been taken, to create 12 regional corporations and approximately just under 200 smaller village corporations to divide up those lands and money. And so, in a nutshell, in Alaska, we don't have reservations, we have corporations. And any Alaska Native with at least 1/4 Native blood born on or before December 18th, 1971, became a shareholder in one of these regional corporations and could also enroll into one of the smaller village corporations. So, in our region, the Dena'ina people are actually split between 3 regional corporations. The biggest one, or that has the largest number of villages, is the Cook Inlet Region Incorporated, that has the Dena'ina villages, Dena'ina and some other native kind of mixed villages at Seldovia, Ninilchik, Kenai, Salamantoff, Point Possession, Eklutna, Kanik, Talkeetna, and Tyonik. Um, and then there's also towards Bristol Bay, the villages of Pedro Bay and Non-Dalton were enrolled into the Bristol Bay Native Corporation. And for sort of a historical anomaly, the Dena'ina village at Lime Village, the most rural, isolated village for the Dena'ina, and all probably one of the most isolated villages in Alaska, came enrolled into Chalista, and it's the only kind of strictly Dena'ina village, and there's two others that are a bit mixed between Dena'ina and Upper Kuskokwim, Athabaskan, and a little bit of Yupik in there. But most of the Chalista villages are Yupik Eskimo people. So, but what we're talking about right here in Anchorage, my village corporation is Eklutna Inc. It had originally, I think, 129 original shareholders. Today, we're up around 180. And today, Eklutna Inc. is the largest private landholder in the municipality of Anchorage. We also have some significant holdings in the Matanuska-Susitna borough because we were not able to, by the 1970s, there were not enough lands to be able to be selected in our homeland. or right in our proper homeland, I guess. Although we did always
Yeah.
extend into that area too. But
So what we're saying is that most of the village corporation land is in fact in or around the city, which is both means both development and city-esque uses. I know you and I talked about the fact that you guys own the landfill,
right,
for example. So city-esque uses, but also adjacent to the city in places that people
correct,
recreate or want to
correct,
recreate with maybe they don't realize that where they are is not public property, because the really key thing here to know from what I'm hearing from you is that for all practical purposes, the unlike the lower 48 where native peoples have reservations, you have private land. That's just, it is for all practical purposes, it is privately owned
correct.
property. And there isn't a great way to tell when you're somebody out for a hike where one starts and the other one stops, which is one of the reasons we're talking today.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, if you're really paying attention, especially if you go up towards Eklutna Lake, there are some signs. We do put up quite a few no trespassing signs, although a lot of them get ripped down. But just for a frame of reference, most of the land on the, if you're facing the lake, on the right hand side of the lake, the side that doesn't have a trail, that's all Eklutna land that's being managed currently by Chugach State Parks. And there's a number of places where we have easements, but then there's also other locations that we've developed into subdivisions and housing. So it's finding that balance. And that was one of the challenges. Initially, when the incorporators of the village corporation were selecting lands, they were both trying to find lands that would be obviously of the highest and best economic use, but they also wanted to protect lands that were exceedingly important culturally and spiritually. And so, also, obviously, a lot of the land as closest to the village would have been selected so that a subdivision didn't pop up right next to the village. They wanted to maintain as much as they could the more rural characteristic. Today, about 50 of our members live in the Eklutna village proper, but there's about 300 tribal members that are again spread out throughout the city and the state and even the lower 48.
So, I guess the other thing to know is that, as you mentioned, your traditional land, so not land currently held by the corporation, is humongous. I am talking to you on traditional Dena'ina land right now,
Mhm.
and we are not geographically close together per se. I mean, you're probably about 40 miles from me right
Right.
now by road. So your traditional lands are very vast, which means that even if people are not recreating or using land that is currently owned by the Dena'ina, it was previously used by the Dena'ina, which is why we are talking today to talk about the respectful and use of these traditional lands and what people need to know and think about while they're using it to really keep that in mind and be respectful of that.
Right. Yeah, pretty much all the land sort of north of Anchorage. When you go south of Anchorage, when you get past what today is now called, ironically, Indian Alaska, before the railroad and the roads came in, the only way to access those lands were by boat because the mountains literally came right down to the ocean. And so the areas like around, I'll get a phone call maybe once every couple of years from somebody and they'll ask what was the Dena'ina use around Girdwood, for example, a popular ski resort in sort of mountain town. And I have to tell them that we had very limited use of that area for a couple of reasons. Number one, it wasn't a very subsistence rich area for us. There was much more desirable lands. It was also very hard to get to. And it was kind of also a borderland, a no man's land between us and the Chugach, Alutiiq people of Prince William Sound over the mountains at what today is Whittier. So there were a couple of locations that we didn't visit that much, but generally speaking, most of the lands, unless you're up in some of the most sort of inhospitable highest peaks, you're really into mountain climbing or something, wouldn't have been used, although they certainly had those, many of those mountains had Dena'ina names.
Right. So, speaking of Dena'ina names, I mentioned earlier that you're working on a native place name project, and this is going to come into what we'll talk about here in just a little bit, but just give us an overview of what that project is.
Sure. Well, this all really started to kick off in 2006, shortly after I graduated from college. Um, the city of Anchorage was looking for the name for its new $110 million convention center. And it was proposed, I being one of them, had proposed that it be named after, instead of one individual, that it be named after the indigenous people of South Central Alaska. It should be pointed out that we had tried unsuccessfully a couple of years earlier to get both Eagle River High School and South Anchorage High School to be some sort of reference to the Dena'ina. But although they were considered, I would say they were not seriously considered. But anyways, make a long story short, we were successful with the Dena'ina Center. And so this kind of opened up most people's eyes, wanting to know, okay, who are the Dena'ina? I had no idea. I've lived here my whole life. And so out of that became a number of projects, many of which we had formally identified in a class that I helped co-teach at the University of Alaska Anchorage, in both locations that were important to the Dena'ina, but were also highly visible. It's not really a surprise that many of the places that are the most popular today for recreation by people are the same locations that the Dena'ina used, especially along the coast and the coastal trails. So starting at Dagaitnu or Stickleback Creek or Ship Creek, heading south all along the coast to Nuchishtunt, Point Warnzoff, Uchinabada Point Campbell, Kincaid area, um, Gachbutnu, Rabbit Creek, Hakati Tali, Potter Marsh. So there had been a number of kind of standard, what I would call park interpretive panels. We're all familiar with what they are.
Yeah, like like you see on a trail that just gives you some information about some sort of history and the
Correct.
plant. Yeah.
Exactly. Or birds or whatever. And
Yeah,
and
yeah,
so
yeah,
we
yeah.
had done a number of those in a lot of those locations, and that was great. But one of the things that I started to notice is that, like anything, you have to stay on top of them, and they have a 10-year shelf life.
Mhm. Yeah. They start peeling, the laminate
Correct.
gets
Yeah.
weird.
I mean,
Yeah.
even if they're not sort of defaced with graffiti and that kind of
Right, right,
thing.
right. And let's be honest, our weather's not great for
No,
keeping things in high quality situation.
no.
It's rough out
Right.
there.
And so there were those, but what had occurred to me was I started to get a lot of inquiries for the same areas from different organizations. And so it being the sort of the local resource, which I'm happy to be, I wanted more of a coordinated effort instead of just sort of, oh, we have this little pot of money, wouldn't it be great to put it here and so forth. And so because these organizations were interested, I think starting in 2016 or 2017, I formed a group to come around this particular issue and really tried to make it more of a larger place name movement that had an agreed upon sort of aesthetic and design that made more of a sort of, I hate to use the word monument, but more of a visual statement, I guess. Um,
Right. Right, like
right.
noticeable, because that's what you want. You don't want somebody. Let's be honest. It's easy. It's easy to ignore the tiny signs, right?
There-
Like you want
yeah.
something that people are gonna see and
Yeah,
notice.
I do like the idea sometimes of people discovering little pockets of things. I mean, there's even been a few things I've discovered that I didn't know existed. There aren't too many, but there's a couple where there might be a passing reference to the Dena'ina. But yes, but more substantial. And so I formed a group with the Anchorage Museum, the Alaska Native Heritage Center, the Anchorage Parks Foundation, South Central Foundation, the Alaska Federation of Natives, First Alaskans Institute, Coconut Housing Authority, Alaska Pacific University, and the Bristol Bay Education Foundation to come together, and we sort of talked through this whole process. We documented it, sort of identified what are best practices, with the goal of identifying approximately 30 locations throughout the Anchorage Bowl where we would like to see these interpretive markers installed. We knew going in that that it'll be a major investment, and that it could take a couple of decades to get them all in place. So we sort of also categorized them into sort of three levels of priority. The first 10 being the sort of most visible, highest yield, kind of most eyeballs, the most popular places that people recreate, but also were exceedingly important locations, and started working on installing them, well, fundraising I should say, and then eventually installing them. So currently we have two on Chanchnu or Chester Creek, one at the mouth of Chanchnu at Westchester Lagoon, which I think on a slow day gets a couple hundred people going by it. On a busy day, a couple thousand in the summer. And then there's another one further up, not too far from actually where I grew up in Northeast Anchorage at Chanchnu Muldoon Park. But also, what's great about that is that it's part of this whole redevelopment of that area. And so eventually, it's also our hope that we'll develop a curriculum, a website, a virtual app.
And these, just so that people who aren't familiar with these locations are picturing them, what you're describing, these where these place names are really very much city parks. They are not, again, they are not in rural areas. They're off of city streets. The Westchester Lagoon one is down the street from downtown Anchorage, like maybe, I don't know, a couple miles tops. These are very much city locations. Right. And so when I'm imagining when you place these there and pick these spots for those things, what you're doing isn't just saying, this is what this used to be called. It's saying, this is a touchstone to how this land used to be seen and used before this development and these streets and these cars and even these recreators who are out here, enjoying this space now, were here. This is the touchstone to the past.
Certainly, yeah, I would say certainly for the first 10 in particular. Then the next 10, I would say, are still visited, but you could kind of see where it has much more of a rural feel to it. Maybe they're not right in downtown Anchorage. They might be out the Eagle River or up in the mountains. And then the last 10, I would say, are broadly much more kind of isolated rural locations, or even closer to the village, that certainly people do recreate on, but maybe don't think of them necessarily as a park, I guess, in the classic sense of the definition. So yeah, they really do kind of run the gamut. Because again, I do like the idea of people uncovering some of these things that aren't so especially once they become accustomed to it. I mean, in a sense, you're covering it at Westchester Lagoon, but if you have any sense of place and history, and you've been living here for any amount of time, you would have picked up at least some of this by now. It's been 15 years of these kinds of efforts.
Right. Hey, humans. If you want to build your own outdoor habit, the Humans Outside 365 Challenge is a great way to get started. You can even score some really cool and exclusive challenge swag, including a finisher decal and medal in the process. All you need to do is visit humansoutside.com/challenge. You'll also get an outdoor challenge guide written by me for you, an exclusive challenge tracker, and insider info all year long. You don't want to be left out of this. Go to humansoutside.com/challenge to learn more now. Okay, back to the show. So, in addition to understanding that connection, just by, if only that touchstone of the traditional name, can you walk us through best practices for recreating and using traditional lands? I'm thinking about the spots that aren't private property now, but are part of the Chugach State Park, or even just where I live. My next door neighbor is a high school, and of course that's still traditional Dena'ina land. And there is a trail system on the back side of the high school that I use, so it's just things like that. What are best practices for using these traditional lands from that frame of reference? And how can we honor that tradition while recreating responsibly. I will add that we're used to things like leave no trace and that kind of principle, but I'm wondering about maybe a step more.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean that's the biggest one, I would say, obviously. Um, also, if you do come across something that says private property, no trespassing, owned by Eklutna Inc., be respectful of that. But so those are the obvious ones. But it's also, I think, what's important about what you said about leave no trace is an ethic that the Dena'ina practiced incredibly diligently. And so this sort of, in some ways, came back around to bite us, in a sense that because you're not seeing, massive areas that had been cleared out, or something like that, that you think nobody was here, which is not true. It was quite the opposite. Our belief was that you leave a place better than you found it. So things like, even if you're not the one creating the trash, if you come across trash, pick it up if you can. Those kinds of things. I mean, that all goes into it. I mean, I think that's pretty standard stuff.
But maybe a little bit of that is something really important you just said, which is this tradition of leaving it better than you found it. And when we leave no trace of our own and then take that extra step, I kind of wonder if there isn't a respect being
Yes.
paid in doing it because that is your
Yes.
tradition. That now I'm taking that step because it's inspired by the previous or traditional
Right.
landowners.
Well, it's also related to the idea that, it's sort of in a lot of, and I don't want to paint a completely broad brush, but in a lot of ways, sort of the idea of Western thinking is that we are above nature, and that we are sort of conquering it or tackling it, or that we survived it. You know what I mean? You think about first ascents, or you think about people that like to pioneer new routes, all these things. To us, that's not the way we think about it. We're one with, in fact, the signs say, Yorok Atsadalti, which means we live upon and with the outdoors. So when you're picking up those things, it's not just being respectful to us, it's also being respectful to the land itself, to the animals, to the plants, to the bugs. I mean, not to get too real kind of philosophical here, but it all plays a part. And I know it's tough in some places, but if you see something pretty egregious, then, and you can do something about it, you really should. Um, I think it's also, yeah, again, I know there is this belief of, when it goes back, I mean, the environmental movement of, in the classic way we think of environmentalism, going back to, Henry David Thoreau or John Muir, but it's largely built upon this sort of 19th century thinking that removes indigenous populations from their lands, and that thinks that this is pristine, untouched wilderness. And that does not exist. Again, with very few exceptions of areas that were just inhospitable, and maybe because of climate change have become more hospitable. Um, indigenous populations were there. And so I think, just let the land sort of speak to you, and but also think that the Dena'ina were a part of it, and that we're still here. I think, another thought is that, unlike most of the United States, where certainly on the East Coast, where indigenous populations were removed from their lands and sometimes sent thousands of miles away, we're still here. We're still living largely on our traditional homeland. Now, it looks very different. I like to say, despite all the hotels, offices, and shopping malls that exist today, I know that I'm still walking on my and my ancestors' traditional homeland. Now, it might be on a sidewalk, but the mountains are still the same, the ocean's still the same. I mean, obviously there are some changes, but just that sense of connection to place. I think that's really, I guess, what I'm trying to say is, how can you not just extract from these locations, but how can you give back to them and feel connected to this place?
So, how can you give back to a place?
Well,
when
Well, like I
you
said,
are when you're outside.
being respectful of the land, thinking about the Dena'ina people, making an effort to try to learn a little bit about the history of the area. Maybe you've got a favorite place. There are some wonderful resources that exist. The best being a book called Shem Pete's Alaska. It's an ethnogeography of Upper Cook Inlet that has documented most of these locations with their Dena'ina names and a little bit of the history of these areas. Again, it varies. Some of them might just be a place name that's noted, but in others, there's rich oral tradition of these places. Yeah, I think that just thinking about and then trying to learn more and learning some of the resources and being an advocate for these places and supporting movements like what we're trying to do.
You know, when you say just thinking about it, I'm reminded of another interview for this season of Humans Outside that will have aired when people hear our conversation with a gentleman named Ira Edwards. And he and I talked about disability access on the trails. And one of the things that came up was this idea that as somebody who does not have a disability, so myself versus Ira, who's in a wheelchair, is not, this discussion is not unlike what you and I are talking about because you come from this Indigenous population and I don't, right? So for me to step in and be an advocate, and for our listeners who are not from Indigenous populations or aren't a member of the disabled community, it is an exercise in thinking. And when you think things, suddenly they are in your awareness and now you're talking about them and asking about them and interested in them. And now everyone's more aware because you're bringing it up. And now this is something that factors into decisions that
Right.
are made because we all suddenly care about it. And I think that people really underestimate the power that just that awareness has. We say, just think about it. Well, okay, that sounds like nothing, except that thinking about something becomes something over time because it starts to drive you when it's in your awareness like that. And that's what being a partner on something is all about. It's just consistently making it a part of your priorities about the things that you bring up. So it's when I talk about trail access, I'm talking in Ira's case, I'm also saying, well, have you, when we're building this trail, did you think about how far apart these poles are for getting on the trail? Because people can't fit a wheelchair through
Mm-hmm.
here. So how's that going to go? Or it's saying in that same conversation, when you put this trail in, what was the connection with the tribes?
Right.
Did we talk to them? How does this honor the previous landholders? What leave no trace principles are you practicing and putting this in? And that's just one example. But all of that stems from just what you said, literally just awareness.
Right. Well, I think you're spot on. And again, it should be important. And it reminds me that this is not something that I really grew up with. This is something that I had to discover largely on my own, not completely, but for the most part. So as a kid, I did not think of this. I don't want to say at all. I knew that once upon a time, certainly we had fish camps at Ship Creek, and that we practiced subsistence on the Eklutna River and the area around the village, but that was about it. I did not it was not communicated to me any of this. But what I found was, all of a sudden, especially after I started a concerted effort to learn my language, how much of that information became a part of my thinking whenever I would traverse through any of our lands. So in a way, it's never too late to start, and you don't need to feel guilty that it didn't exist. But what can you do to try to pick it up? And I love your analogy of the accessibility issue for disabled. And I guess what you're talking about too is how can we do things in a more inclusive and smarter way, because it's a little bit more effort, but it's not usually that much more of an investment.
Right. Well, and it really just goes back to asking the question.
Right.
So okay, so let's say we ask the question, how did you include Indigenous tradition in this? Or what was your connection with tribe when building this? Or how are we thinking about that while working on this project? So there are now two choices. The people who are doing the project can say, we didn't and we're not. Okay. And then you have the opportunity to say, but why? Or maybe they just didn't think
Right.
about it, right? So now they have the opportunity to take that next step. And what Ira was talking about was it's not ever that people don't want to include disabled access. It's that they didn't bother to have somebody who is actually in a wheelchair come and be a part of the
Right.
project. And so they didn't think of all this stuff. It was road to hell is paved with great
Yeah, or what is it?
intentions.
Ignorance is bliss.
And ignorance is bliss, right? So many cliches. There are all sorts of them are possible here, and the reason there are so many is because they happen all the
Right.
time. So, and so I would imagine the same discussion is true here as well. Especially in
Mhm.
Alaska, we have a lot of members of indigenous populations around. But for people who are in the lower 48, the population of Native Americans compared to the non-Native American population is much
Mhm.
smaller by percentage. And so it probably is actually a much bigger effort to ask that question and have that connection. But it does not mean it's not
Right.
worth it. It does not mean that it's not important. And really, at the end of the day, so much of this stuff comes back to the extra effort of thinking about interests outside of your own general realm of experience. It's as simple as
Yeah,
that.
no, I think you're spot on. And it's interesting, and part of it also comes from the work that I do 9 to 5 at the Anchorage Museum, where we historically museums haven't had these discussions, but in the last 30 years, we've had very much these discussions around ADA compliance, and how high you put labels up, and how can people access things in multiple ways, and all those things. So we were actually sort of tasked with thinking about some of these things that the public doesn't ever think about, but certainly somebody in a wheelchair would appreciate when they're able to go through an exhibition and not get stopped because the cases are too close together or whatnot, or they can't read the labels because they're 48 inches instead of 36.
Right, right, right. And it's that extra step, and it can be hard to do, but I think that conversations like these really help with raising not just awareness like we were talking about earlier, but giving all the reasons why this is an important thing to do. Because something else you said earlier about the pristine untouched land, right? That's not true. But we're taught to honor the space that we're used as if that were true.
Right.
It's the cultural fact. This is pristine untouched wilderness, except that it's not really. So how, and each person needs to answer this for themselves, but how does knowing that this is both, it can be both pristine wilderness and previously touched at the
Correct.
same time, and you can honor it in both ways, and how does that change how you're using it, and how should it change it? And that's something I kind of think maybe people have to ask or question themselves on, but even having the question planted is such a huge
Right.
step. So thank you so much for joining us to talk about this. The very last thing we're going to talk about today, to wrap this up in a little bow, is maybe your favorite outdoor memory. We talked about how you started spending more time outside. So as a final thing in our show, I always ask our guests to walk us out their favorite outdoor memory, just something that they just love to think about of spending time outside. And we've talked a lot about your homeland and ways to treat it. So maybe you have a memory that you can share with us that's related to that.
So probably the one that pops into my brain is in 2007. I had an opportunity to actually go to Lime Village again on the Upper Stony River. There's about 30 people that live in the village, and there's a small an Air Force kind of radar station about 30 miles from the village. But outside of that, there's not another human settlement for about 150 mile radius. And this is an incredibly important Dena'ina location. And we went from Lime Village up the Stony River to another Dena'ina village that's called Cognelan or Canyon, that was said to be not just a phenomenal location for in the summer for fish, but spiritually a very important place. A lot of stories have been talked about this, and a lot of elders in non-Dalton have connections back to this place. So to go to there, go to Cognelan, and there's this rock that was described in several stories of it's sort of a natural man-made dip netting platform. And the elders that I was with, she had worked with her grandson to make a dip net, and then they used modern mesh, they didn't use sinew, but the form was the same. And he's standing on the rock, and I've got my video camera just sort of documenting this. And sure enough, as soon as he sticks that dip net down, about because it sort of drops off, I think it's about 30 feet deep in that one spot. I mean, he gets that net into the water, and boom, as soon as it goes in about 7 or 8 feet, he's got a fish. I mean, I can't even hit record. He pulls it up, and he turns around, and he dumps it into this depression in the rock that also sort of creates this natural pool for the fish. And so I start filming that, and it's sort of like I'd read about it, but to see it and to see it still exist today was pretty mind-blowing. Also, that part, the upper Stony River, is the only river that I've ever been on that there's no commercial or sports fishing that occurs. And so it's just wild country is the only way I can describe it. But to see that, and then to hike up the hill again as it had been described, and see the village site and still see bits of house remains, because I think it was last occupied probably in the 20s or 30s. You could just see, I mean, not a lot, but it was palpable is the only way I can describe it. And to be there, to be in this place that I could only read about and thought really didn't or couldn't exist, I guess, especially in the way that I think about our lands here in Anchorage and the stories or the sites, the few that we have, none of which are you able to do. Essentially, the activity that we were doing in that moment goes back thousands of years,
Right.
and is largely uninterrupted.
Aaron, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and advice today on Humans Outside. Really appreciate your time.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode of Humans Outside. If you've enjoyed this episode, take a second to leave a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. That makes it easier for others to find the podcast too. Your positive review makes a huge difference. Now, go get outside. Until next time, we'll see you out there.